The heavy military transport plane touched down at London's main airport with a loud thud that shook Captain Marcus Thompson from his restless sleep. He had been dreaming again about the battlefield where everything changed. The same dream that haunted him every night for the past 3 months. Marcus opened his tired eyes and looked out the small window at the gray English sky. Home. After 18 months of war in a distant land, he was finally home. Marcus stood up slowly from his seat, his body still aching from old wounds that never quite healed properly. His dark green military uniform was covered with ribbons and medals that caught the light as he moved. Other passengers on the plane stared at him with curious eyes. They knew he was someone important, someone who had done something special during the war, but Marcus wished they would just look away. The flight attendant smiled warmly at him as he walked toward the exit. "Welcome home, Captain," she said softly. "Thank you for your service." Marcus nodded politely but said nothing. He had heard those words so many times now that they felt empty. People meant well, but they could never understand what he had really been through. As Marcus stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, he was surprised by what he saw. Dozens of people were waiting with signs and flowers. News reporters with cameras and microphones pushed forward trying to get his attention. Someone had told them he was coming home today. The crowd began clapping and cheering when they saw his uniform and medals. "Captain Thompson! Captain Thompson!" the reporters shouted. "How does it feel to be home? Can you tell us about what happened that day? Are you proud of what you did?" Marcus felt his chest tighten. He did not want to talk about that day. He did not want to remember the sounds of explosions and gunfire. He did not want to think about the faces of his friends who never made it home. But the cameras kept flashing, and the questions kept coming. A young boy broke free from his mother's hand and ran up to Marcus. The child looked up at him with wide, admiring eyes. "Are you really a hero, mister?" the boy asked innocently. Marcus knelt down to the boy's level, his heart heavy. "I'm just a soldier who did his job," he replied quietly. "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home." The boy's mother quickly pulled her son back, embarrassed. But Marcus saw understanding in her eyes. She could see the sadness behind his brave face. Marcus walked through the crowd as quickly as he could, shaking a few hands and accepting some flowers that people pushed toward him. Everyone wanted to touch him, to be part of his story. But all Marcus wanted was to disappear. He wanted to go somewhere quiet where he could forget about the war, forget about the terrible choices he had to make, forget about the friends he could not save. An old man in a wheelchair grabbed Marcus's arm as he passed by. The man wore an old military jacket with faded medals from a war fought long ago. "I know that look in your eyes, son," the old veteran whispered. "It gets easier with time, but it never really goes away. You did good over there. Don't let anyone tell you different." Marcus looked into the old man's eyes and saw the same haunted expression he saw in his own mirror every morning. For the first time since coming home, Marcus felt like someone truly understood. Outside the airport, Marcus climbed into a black car that would take him to his small apartment. As the car drove through the busy London streets, he watched ordinary people living their ordinary lives. They went to work, walked their dogs, laughed with friends. They had no idea what it was like to see friends die, to make impossible decisions under enemy fire, to carry the weight of other people's lives on their shoulders. Tomorrow, Marcus would have to put on his dress uniform and go to the royal palace. The queen herself would give him the highest medal for bravery that a soldier could receive. Everyone would call him a hero again. But tonight, he just wanted to be alone with his memories and his guilt. The car stopped at his building, and Marcus slowly climbed the stairs to his empty apartment. On his kitchen table was a letter with the royal seal. Inside were instructions for tomorrow's ceremony, and a reminder of how important this honor was. Marcus set the letter aside and sat in his chair by the window. As darkness fell over London, Captain Marcus Thompson stared out at the city lights and wondered if he would ever feel normal again. The war was over, but the battle inside his mind had just begun. Lieutenant James Wellington woke up at exactly 5 in the morning, just as he had done every day for the past 12 years. His small apartment near the palace was neat and organized like everything else in his life. James believed in order, discipline, and following rules. These things had kept him safe and successful during his long career as a royal guard. James looked at himself in the bathroom mirror as he shaved his face, with careful, precise movements. At 34 years old, he was one of the most respected guards in the entire palace. He had never been late for duty, never complained about long hours, and never broken a single rule. Other guards looked up to him as an example of what a perfect royal guard should be. After his morning routine, James put on his crisp uniform and polished his black boots until they shined like mirrors. Today was an important day. There would be a medal ceremony in the throne room, and every guard had to be absolutely perfect. The Queen herself would be present, along with important government officials and members of the royal family. James walked through the quiet London streets toward the palace, thinking about all the rules he had memorized over the years. Royal guards were not allowed to speak during ceremonies unless spoken to first. They could not move their heads to look around. They could not smile, frown, or show any emotion on their faces. They had to stand perfectly still with their eyes looking straight ahead, no matter what happened around them. At the palace, James met with the other guards in the preparation room. Sergeant Mills, the head guard, was reviewing the important rules one more time. His stern voice filled the room as he spoke to the 20 guards who would be on duty today. "Remember, gentlemen," Sergeant Mills said seriously, "today we have cameras and reporters watching everything we do. One mistake from any of you will embarrass the entire royal family. You will stand like statues. You will not react to anything you see or hear. You are invisible servants of the crown." James had heard this speech many times before, but he listened carefully anyway. He remembered what happened to Guard Peterson 3 years ago. Peterson had coughed during the Queen's Christmas speech. Just one small cough, but it was caught on television cameras. Peterson was immediately removed from duty and never allowed to work at the palace again. His career was destroyed because of one tiny mistake. "Wellington," Sergeant Mills called out, "you will be positioned behind the medal recipient today. This is a position of great trust. I know you will not disappoint us." James nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. I understand completely." The other guards looked at James with respect. Everyone knew that being chosen for such an important position meant that the palace leaders trusted him more than anyone else. James felt proud but also nervous. Standing behind the medal recipient meant he would be very close to all the action. He would need to be extra careful not to make any mistakes. As the guards walked to their positions in the throne room, James thought about all the ceremonies he had witnessed over the years. He had seen presidents and prime ministers receive honors. He had watched famous actors and musicians get special awards from the Queen. He had stood silently during weddings, funerals, and state dinners. Through it all, James had remained perfectly disciplined and professional. The throne room was already being prepared for the ceremony. Palace workers were arranging chairs and testing camera equipment. The golden throne sat majestically at the front of the room, surrounded by centuries-old paintings and decorations. Everything in this room represented the long history and traditions of the royal family. James took his assigned position and practiced standing perfectly still. He reminded himself of all the rules one more time. No matter what happened during the ceremony, he would remain motionless and silent. He would honor the traditions that had been followed for hundreds of years. He would be the perfect royal guard, just as he had always been. But James had no idea that today would test everything he believed about duty, rules, and what it truly meant to serve with honor. The grand throne room slowly filled with important people as the morning sun streamed through the tall windows. Captain Marcus Thompson stood in the waiting area, adjusting his dress uniform one more time. His hand shook slightly as he tried to straighten his tie. He had faced enemy soldiers without fear, but something about this royal ceremony made him feel more nervous than he had ever felt in battle. A palace official approached Marcus with a warm smile. "Captain Thompson, are you ready? The ceremony will begin in just a few minutes. The Queen is very excited to meet you and present you with this honor." Marcus nodded but said nothing. He could hear voices and footsteps in the throne room as more guests arrived. Through the doorway, he caught glimpses of men in expensive suits and women in beautiful dresses. Everyone looked so clean and perfect, so different from the dirty, dangerous world he had just left behind. Lieutenant James Wellington stood at his assigned position, behind where Marcus would soon be standing. James kept his eyes focused straight ahead, but he could see everything happening in the room through his peripheral vision. Television cameras were being positioned to get the best angles. Newspaper photographers were testing their equipment. Government ministers were taking their seats in the front rows. The Queen entered the throne room, and everyone immediately stood up and remained silent. She wore an elegant blue dress with a matching hat and carried herself with the grace that came from decades of royal experience. Behind her walked Prince Charles and other members of the royal family. The ceremony was about to begin. Marcus was escorted into the throne room by two palace officials. As he walked down the center aisle, he could feel hundreds of eyes watching his every step. The camera flashes were bright and constant. He tried to focus on walking straight and keeping his military bearing, but his heart was pounding so hard he worried people might be able to hear it. James watched as Marcus approached his position. From his close vantage point, James could see details that others in the room could not see. He noticed that Marcus's hands were trembling slightly. He saw sweat on the captain's forehead, despite the cool temperature in the room. Most importantly, James could see something in Marcus's eyes that he recognized from his own experiences as a soldier before joining the palace guard. The Queen took her position at the front of the room and began to speak in her clear, authoritative voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to honor extraordinary courage and selfless service. Captain Marcus Thompson displayed remarkable bravery during a recent military operation that saved many lives." As the Queen continued reading from the official citation, James found himself actually listening to the words instead of simply standing at attention. Usually during ceremonies, James would let his mind wander to other things while maintaining his perfect posture. But today was different. The story the Queen was telling was not just formal words on paper. It was about real people, real danger, and real heroism. Captain Thompson was serving as a squad leader when his unit came under heavy enemy attack. The Queen continued. Despite being outnumbered and surrounded, Captain Thompson made the decision to stay behind and provide cover while his soldiers retreated to safety. He personally rescued 5 wounded soldiers, carrying them to safety one by one while under constant enemy fire. James felt something stirring in his chest as he listened to these words. He had been a soldier himself before joining the palace guard. Though he had never seen combat like this, he could imagine what it must have been like for Marcus to make such a dangerous choice, to risk his own life again and again to save his friends. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived, the Queen went on. Captain Thompson was the last person to leave the battlefield. He refused medical treatment for his own injuries until he was certain that all of his soldiers were receiving care. His actions that day prevented what could have been a devastating loss of life. Marcus stood perfectly still as the Queen spoke, but James could see that the captain was struggling to control his emotions. The formal words of the citation were bringing back memories that Marcus had been trying to forget. James saw Marcus's jaw tighten and his breathing become more rapid. The other people in the throne room were listening politely to the Queen's words, but James could tell that most of them did not truly understand what they were hearing. To them, this was just another ceremony, another award presentation to attend. They could not imagine what it felt like to make life and death decisions under enemy fire. They could not understand the weight that Marcus must be carrying. The Queen stepped forward holding the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor that could be given to a British soldier. The medal hung from a deep red ribbon and caught the light from the chandeliers above. Everyone in the throne room held their breath as this historic moment approached. Camera flashes filled the air like lightning as photographers captured every second. Captain Marcus Thompson tried to focus on the honor he was receiving, but his mind kept drifting back to that terrible day on the battlefield. He could almost hear the sounds of gunfire and explosions again. He could see the faces of his fallen friends, the soldiers he could not save despite his best efforts. The weight of survivors' guilt pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy stone. Lieutenant James Wellington watched from his position just a few feet behind Marcus. James had perfect view of everything that was happening, and he could see details that the cameras and audience could not capture. He noticed how Marcus's hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. He saw the captain's chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to control his breathing. "Captain Marcus Thompson," the Queen said in her formal voice, "for exceptional bravery and selfless devotion to duty, I present you with the Victoria Cross." She stepped closer to Marcus and carefully placed the ribbon around his neck. The medal settled against his chest, joining the other ribbons and decorations he had earned during his military service. As soon as the medal touched his uniform, something inside Marcus finally broke. All the emotions he had been holding back for months came flooding out at once. Tears began streaming down his face, and his whole body started to shake. He tried to maintain his military posture, but the overwhelming feelings were too strong to control. The audience watched in surprised silence as this decorated war hero showed his true human emotions. Some people looked uncomfortable, not knowing how to react to such a raw display of feeling during a formal royal ceremony. Others seemed moved by the genuine pain and gratitude they were witnessing. Marcus thought about his friend Sergeant Williams, who had died in his arms during the attack. He remembered Private Johnson, barely 19 years old, who never made it to the rescue helicopter. He thought about Corporal Martinez, who had 3 children at home and would never see them grow up. All these good soldiers had died while Marcus lived. Why had he survived when they did not? James watched Marcus break down and felt his own eyes filling with tears. In 12 years of royal ceremonies, James had never seen such honest emotion. He had watched politicians receive honors they did not deserve, celebrities get awards for simply being famous, and wealthy people buy their way into royal recognition. But this was different. This was a man who had truly sacrificed everything for others and was still suffering because of it. The Queen stood patiently as Marcus struggled to compose himself. She had seen many medal ceremonies during her long reign, but she recognized that this moment was special. This was not about royal protocol or formal traditions. This was about honoring genuine heroism and acknowledging real sacrifice. Marcus tried to speak the traditional words that recipients were supposed to say, but his voice would not work properly. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he finally whispered. "I accept this honor on behalf of all the soldiers who could not come home." Those words hit James like a physical blow to his chest. He realized that Marcus was not crying because he was happy about receiving the medal. He was crying because he felt guilty about being the one who survived. He was crying for his friends who would never receive recognition, never come home to their families, never have the chance to live normal lives again. The other guards in the room maintained their rigid positions, but James could tell that some of them were also affected by what they were witnessing. These were men who understood military service and sacrifice. They knew the difference between ceremony and reality, between playing soldier and being one. As Marcus wiped tears from his face with his sleeve, James felt something powerful awakening inside his own heart. For years, he had followed rules and protocols without question. He had stood silently through hundreds of ceremonies, treating them all as just another day at work. But this was not just work. This was about honoring a man who had proven what true courage looked like. The Queen placed her hand gently on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that was not part of the official ceremony, but came from genuine compassion. "Your service and sacrifice will never be forgotten," she said quietly. At that moment, James realized that all the rules and traditions in the world meant nothing compared to simple human recognition of true heroism. Something deep inside him was changing, something that would soon override 12 years of perfect discipline and training. The ceremony was supposed to continue with formal speeches and photographs, but Marcus was still struggling to control his emotions. James could see that the captain needed something more than just official recognition. He needed to know that someone truly understood what he had been through and what he had lost. And for the first time in his career as a Royal Guard, James Wellington felt compelled to do something that had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with respect for a fellow soldier. The moment seemed to stretch forever as Captain Marcus Thompson stood before the Queen, tears still flowing down his cheeks. The Victoria Cross hung heavy around his neck, but it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Every person in the throne room could feel the raw emotion radiating from this broken war hero who had given everything for his country and his fellow soldiers. Lieutenant James Wellington stood just behind Marcus, close enough to hear the captain's quiet sobs. James had been trained to ignore everything around him during ceremonies, to act like a statue that could see and hear nothing. But today, all of that training seemed meaningless. He was watching a real hero struggle with real pain, and every instinct in his body told him that something needed to be done. The Queen continued with the formal parts of the ceremony, but her voice was gentler now. She could see that Marcus was fighting an internal battle that had nothing to do with enemy soldiers or battlefield danger. This was the fight that many veterans faced when they came home, the fight against guilt, grief, and the terrible question of why they survived when others did not. James felt his right hand beginning to move without his permission. His fingers were twitching, wanting to rise to his forehead. Every rule he had ever learned screamed at him to stay still, to remain disciplined, to honor the protocols that had governed his entire career. But something stronger was pulling at him, the need to show respect to a fellow soldier who deserved recognition that went beyond medals and ceremonies. Marcus tried to straighten his shoulders and regain his military bearing, but the emotions were too overwhelming. He thought about writing letters to the families of his fallen friends, trying to explain how their sons and husbands had died. He remembered visiting hospitals and seeing other soldiers who had been wounded in the same battle. Some had lost arms or legs. Others had brain injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. All of them had suffered while Marcus walked away with minor injuries and a chest full of medals. The television cameras continued filming every moment of Marcus's breakdown, but the camera operators seemed to understand that they were capturing something important. This was not just news footage. This was a document of what real heroism looked like when stripped of all the glory and pageantry that usually surrounded it. James felt 12 years of perfect discipline cracking like ice under pressure. He had followed orders and obeyed rules his entire adult life. He had never questioned authority or broken protocol. But right now, watching Marcus struggle with survivor's guilt and genuine grief, James realized that some things were more important than rules. The other guests in the throne room watched in respectful silence as Marcus continued to weep. Government ministers who had never seen combat, wealthy socialites who had never faced real danger, and foreign diplomats who knew nothing about military sacrifice were all witnessing something that made their own problems seem small and meaningless. Without conscious thought, without planning or hesitation, James Wellington slowly began to raise his white-gloved right hand toward his forehead. The movement was smooth and deliberate, like something his body had been programmed to do. His fellow guards noticed immediately, their eyes widening in shock as they realized what was happening. The hand continued to rise, passing James's shoulder, then his chest, moving inexorably toward his forehead in the classic military salute. Time seemed to slow down as every person in the room became aware of this unprecedented breach of royal protocol. Cameras swung toward James, capturing the moment that would change everything. James's hand reached his forehead and stayed there for exactly 3 seconds. It was a perfect military salute, crisp and respectful, the kind of gesture that one soldier gives to another to show honor and recognition. In those 3 seconds, James communicated everything that the formal ceremony could not express, that Marcus's sacrifice was seen, understood, and deeply appreciated by someone who knew what military service really meant. Marcus felt the salute before he saw it. Something made him turn slightly. And when he spotted James holding that forbidden gesture, his tears stopped flowing. For the first time since returning from war, Marcus felt truly honored. Not by medals or speeches from people who had never been in battle, but by this simple recognition from a fellow soldier who understood what sacrifice looked like. The throne room erupted in gasps and shocked whispers as everyone realized what had just happened. Sergeant Mills, the head guard, looked like he was about to faint. Palace officials began whispering frantically among themselves. The Queen herself paused in the middle of her speech, staring at James with an expression that no one could read. James slowly lowered his hand back to his side, knowing that his career was over but feeling more right about something than he had felt in years. He had broken the most sacred rule of royal protocol, but he had honored something far more important: the brotherhood between soldiers and the recognition that true heroism deserved genuine respect. The moment of the forbidden salute lasted only seconds, but its impact would be felt for years to come. The sound of shocked gasps filled the throne room like a wave crashing against rocks. Every person present understood that they had just witnessed something that had never happened before in the centuries-long history of royal ceremonies. Lieutenant James Wellington had broken the most sacred rule of palace protocol, and everyone knew that such actions traditionally meant immediate dismissal and public disgrace. Sergeant Mills, the head guard, felt his face go pale as he watched his most trusted soldier commit what could only be described as career suicide. Mills had spent 20 years building his reputation as a strict disciplinarian who ran the tightest security operation in the royal family's history. Never once had any of his guards broken protocol during a ceremony. Now, his perfect record was destroyed by the one man he had trusted most. The television cameras immediately swung toward James, their lenses focusing on the guard who had dared to salute during a royal ceremony. Camera operators who had been filming routine footage suddenly realized they were capturing a historic moment that would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world. This was not just breaking news. This was the kind of moment that would be remembered for decades. Palace officials began whispering frantically among themselves, trying to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. Lord Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary, looked absolutely horrified as he calculated the potential damage to the monarchy's reputation. What would the newspapers say? How would foreign dignitaries react? Would this breach of protocol make the entire royal family look weak and undisciplined? The foreign ambassadors and government ministers in the audience exchanged confused glances, not sure how to react to such an unusual situation. Some seemed scandalized by the guard's behavior, while others appeared moved by the obvious sincerity behind the gesture. Everyone was waiting to see how the Queen would respond to this challenge to her authority. James's fellow guards remained frozen in their positions, but their eyes revealed their shock and disbelief. Guard Harrison, who stood 2 positions away from James, felt his own heart racing as he wondered whether he would be punished simply for being in the same room as the protocol breaker. Guard Thompson began sweating despite the cool temperature, worried that this incident would reflect badly on all of them. The newspaper reporters in the press section began scribbling notes furiously, already composing headlines in their minds. Guard salutes hero during royal ceremony. Palace protocol shattered by soldier's gesture. Unprecedented breach stuns royal court. This story would be front-page news in every paper across the country within hours. Captain Marcus Thompson stood motionless, still processing what had just happened. The simple salute had affected him more deeply than all the formal speeches and medal presentations combined. For the first time since returning from war, he felt like someone truly understood what he had been through. Someone recognized his sacrifice, not because they were required to, but because they genuinely respected what military service meant. Lady Catherine Worthington, a prominent member of high society, leaned over to whisper to her companion, "I cannot believe what I just saw. That guard has ruined his entire career for a moment of sentimentality. How absolutely inappropriate." But even as she spoke these words, Lady Catherine found herself wondering if there was something beautiful about the gesture that she was too concerned with propriety to understand. The Queen's security detail began making subtle hand signals to each other, trying to determine if this breach of protocol represented some kind of security threat. Chief Inspector Williams, who was responsible for the Queen's safety, felt his pulse quickening as he tried to assess whether James's action was part of some larger plan to disrupt the ceremony. Dr. Elizabeth Hamilton, a military historian who was attending the ceremony as a special guest, found herself deeply moved by what she had witnessed. She understood better than most people in the room what that salute represented, one soldier honoring another in the purest possible way. In her academic studies, she had read about many examples of military brotherhood, but she had never seen such a powerful demonstration of it. The royal family members on the platform showed various reactions to the unprecedented event. Prince Charles looked stern and disapproving, clearly concerned about the implications for royal dignity. Princess Anne, however, seemed more thoughtful, as if she was trying to understand the deeper meaning behind the guard's action. Young Prince William, who had served in the military himself, felt a completely different reaction than the older royals. He recognized the salute as something that transcended royal protocol. It was one soldier acknowledging another's sacrifice in the most respectful way possible. He found himself admiring the guard's courage, even as he understood the serious consequences the man would face. The ceremony had come to a complete halt as everyone waited to see how the Queen would respond to this extraordinary situation. Her Majesty stood perfectly still, her face showing no emotion that anyone could interpret. She was clearly weighing her options, knowing that whatever she decided would set a precedent that would affect the monarchy for years to come. James Wellington remained at attention, accepting whatever punishment awaited him. He had known the moment he raised his hand that his career was over, but he felt peace in his heart that he had never experienced during his 12 years of perfect obedience to rules that suddenly seemed less important than human decency and respect for genuine heroism. The tension in the throne room was so thick it could almost be cut with a knife as everyone waited for the Queen's judgment. Queen Elizabeth stood perfectly still at the front of the throne room, her mind racing as she faced the most difficult decision of her long reign. In her 70 years as monarch, she had dealt with political crises, family scandals, and international conflicts, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. A single guard's gesture had created a situation that could define how history would remember her leadership. The silence in the throne room was deafening as everyone waited for the Queen's response. Her advisors watched nervously, knowing that whatever she decided would have far-reaching consequences for the monarchy's authority and reputation. Lord Pemberton kept glancing at his watch, aware that news of this incident was probably already spreading through social media and would soon reach newspapers around the world. The Queen looked directly at Lieutenant James Wellington, studying his face carefully. She could see no arrogance or defiance in his expression, only quiet acceptance of whatever punishment awaited him. This was not a rebellious soldier trying to make a political statement. This was a man who had been moved by genuine emotion to break rules that had governed royal ceremonies for centuries. Her Majesty's thoughts turned to her own experiences with military service and sacrifice. During World War II, she had served as a mechanic and driver in the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service. She had seen firsthand what military dedication looked like, and she understood the special bond that existed between soldiers who had faced danger together. Perhaps that understanding was what made this moment so complicated for her. Prince Charles leaned slightly toward his mother, ready to offer advice if she asked for it. He believed strongly in maintaining royal traditions and worried that showing leniency toward protocol breakers would encourage others to ignore established rules. In his mind, the monarchy's strength came from its consistency and adherence to time-tested procedures. But Princess Anne had a different perspective. She had worked closely with military charities for decades and had deep respect for soldiers who served their country with honor. She could see that James's salute had not been an act of disrespect toward royal authority, but rather a genuine expression of military brotherhood that transcended ceremonial protocols. The Queen's private thoughts were interrupted by movement in the press section. She could see reporters frantically typing on their phones and tablets, probably sending preliminary reports about the incident to their editors. Within hours, this story would be broadcast around the world, and her response would be analyzed and debated by millions of people. Captain Marcus Thompson remained standing at attention, but his tears had stopped flowing. The simple salute from James had given him something that months of therapy and medical treatment had not provided: the feeling that his sacrifice was truly understood and appreciated by someone who knew what military service meant. For the first time since returning from war, Marcus felt a small spark of healing in his wounded heart. The Queen remembered other moments in her reign when she had faced choices between strict adherence to tradition and showing human compassion. There was the time she had broken protocol to comfort the families of soldiers killed in the Falklands War. There was her decision to publicly mourn Princess Diana, despite complicated family relationships. There was her choice to honor Nelson Mandela in ways that went beyond traditional diplomatic courtesy. Each of those decisions have been criticized by some people who believe that royalty should remain above human emotions and stick to established procedures. But history had proven that her moments of genuine humanity had actually strengthened the monarchy by showing that the royal family understood and cared about the real struggles of ordinary people. Lord Pemberton approached the Queen discreetly and whispered urgent advice in her ear. "Your Majesty, we must maintain discipline. If we allow this breach to go unpunished, it will encourage others to ignore royal protocol. The authority of the Crown depends on consistent enforcement of established rules." But the Queen also remembered her conversations with military leaders who had told her how important it was for soldiers to feel that their sacrifices were recognized and honored by people who truly understood what they had endured. She thought about all the veterans she had met over the years, many of whom carried invisible wounds that were just as serious as physical injuries. The television cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the Queen's deliberation. Historians would later analyze this footage frame by frame, trying to understand the thought process behind one of the most important decisions in modern royal history. The Queen knew that millions of people were waiting to see whether she would choose tradition over compassion, rules over humanity. As she looked once more at James Wellington, the Queen saw something in his eyes that reminded her of the young soldiers she had worked alongside during the war. These were men and women who understood duty and sacrifice in ways that went far deeper than ceremony and protocol. They knew the difference between following rules because you were told to and serving something greater than yourself because you believed it was right. The Queen's decision would not only determine the fate of one guard and one more hero, but would also send a message to the entire nation about what the monarchy truly valued. Would she choose the safe path of maintaining traditional discipline, or would she risk criticism by showing that sometimes human decency mattered more than institutional rules? The weight of centuries of royal tradition pressed down on her shoulders as Queen Elizabeth prepared to speak words that would change everything. The Queen took a deep breath and looked directly at Lieutenant James Wellington with an expression that seemed to pierce right through him. Every person in the throne room held their breath, waiting for the words that would determine not only James's fate, but also set a precedent that would influence royal protocol for generations to come. The silence was so complete that the ticking of the ancient grandfather clock in the corner seemed as loud as thunder. "Lieutenant Wellington," the Queen began, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades on the throne. James straightened his shoulders, prepared to accept whatever punishment she was about to announce. He had broken the most sacred rule of royal service, and he expected to be dismissed immediately and stripped of all honors he had earned during his 12 years of faithful service. But instead of the harsh condemnation that everyone expected, the Queen's voice softened slightly as she continued speaking. "Today, we have witnessed not a breach of protocol, but a perfect example of what true service means." The words hit the throne room like a lightning bolt, causing gasps of amazement from the assembled guests, who could hardly believe what they were hearing. Sergeant Mills felt his legs go weak as he realized that the Queen was not punishing James for his forbidden salute. Instead, she seemed to be praising him for it. This was completely unprecedented in the entire history of royal ceremonies. Mills had been prepared to escort James from the building in disgrace, but now he stood frozen in confusion and disbelief. The Queen continued with growing conviction in her voice. When one soldier honors another soldier's sacrifice, it reminds us all why we gathered here today. It reminds us that behind every medal and every ceremony, there are real people who have made real sacrifices for their country and their fellow citizens. Lord Pemberton looked absolutely stunned by the Queen's words. This was not the response he had advised, and he worried about the implications for royal authority. But as he watched the faces of people in the audience, he began to see something unexpected. Instead of looking scandalized by the Queen's support of the protocol breach, many guests seemed moved and inspired by her words. Captain Marcus Thompson felt tears returning to his eyes, but these were different tears than before. Instead of crying from pain and guilt, he was crying from relief and gratitude. The Queen's words, combined with James's salute, had given him something he had not felt since returning from war. The sense that his sacrifice was truly understood and valued by people who mattered. The television cameras captured every word and gesture as the Queen made her historic statement. News anchors around the world would later describe this as one of the most surprising and powerful moments in recent royal history. The Queen had chosen to break with tradition herself, supporting a guard who had broken protocol in service of something higher than rules and regulations. Prince Charles still looked concerned about the implications of his mother's decision, but Prince William felt proud of his grandmother's choice. As someone who had served in the military, William understood exactly what the Queen was trying to communicate. Sometimes the spirit of service was more important than the letter of the law. The Queen then did something that stunned everyone in the throne room, even more than her words had done. She turned slightly toward James and gave him a small, barely noticeable nod of approval. It was a gesture so subtle that the cameras barely caught it, but everyone in the front rows could see that the monarch was personally thanking the guard for his moment of authentic human connection. James felt his heart swell with emotions he could barely contain. Instead of ending his career in disgrace, the Queen had transformed his forbidden salute into an example of proper service. She had shown that the monarchy was strong enough to value humanity over rigid protocol when the situation called for it. The audience began to react to the Queen's unexpected response with a mixture of surprise, admiration, and approval. Many people started applauding spontaneously, not because it was expected or traditional, but because they had witnessed something genuinely moving. The applause grew louder and more enthusiastic as more guests joined in. Dr. Elizabeth Hamilton, the military historian, found herself deeply impressed by the Queen's wisdom and courage. Her Majesty had managed to honor both military tradition and royal authority, while also showing compassion for human emotion. It was a masterful display of leadership that would be studied and admired for years to come. The Queen raised her hand slightly to quiet the applause, then turned back to Captain Marcus Thompson to continue with the medal ceremony. But the atmosphere in the throne room had completely changed.